Well, it's been something of a challenging week at the
really
garage.
has.
We lost a whole day being glued to the TV.
Right.
But we're also trying to do some things that we're not quite sure how to proceed. You've been coming up with some fun little projects. This was fun.
Mostly keeping myself occupied.
This is your snow globe. That is the teeny tiniest snow globe.
Yeah, I bought glass beads from eBay just for the occasion. I had one in a kit, and I thought, I bet you could make more of them.
Now, Steve has also been quite busy. He's building us the sand house for the Chama cooling tower.
Which is turning out really nice.
Really neat. Here's the stove that heats the sand so it can dry it out. It was all dried by hand by dumping sand into this stove.
Boy, I'll tell you, that was a lot of work.
Well, back then, I guess, the cheapest thing on the railroad was the labor. But look how neat the sand house is turning out. Is that amazing?
That's really cool.
So he's been working on the tower here for I don't know what you'd call this, the sand tank, that the dry sand is blown up into this tank, and then from there gravity feeds down into the locomotives. But he's doing a full interior for this building, and that's just really turning out to be quite neat.
It is.
Now, the sand tank up here is actually made out of a piece of PVC sewer pipe.
Wow.
But everything else is built out of wood. Well, almost everything else. The air compressor is made out of plastic and metal bits, but the basic structure and everything is 100% wood. Now, years ago, Steve built this part of the logging railroad, and he laid it onto these log ties. And we've been trying to figure out how to go about doing log ties, and we've been hunting the yard for sticks.
Right.
And you've also been making some ties out of dowels and so on, but it's been experimentation. I've been beating up some of my cedar ties to use those, and we've been in search of sticks, which takes an enormous amount of time to find a straight 4-inch long stick that's the exact right diameter. And this has just proven to be challenging.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was going to be challenging, but it has proven to be just a bit challenging. But I like how the beat up ties are turning out.
Right.
Those are looking really neat. And actually, as we started really getting into making these ties, the ties that you made out of dowels are turning out to be our best ones.
Wow, that's that's pretty interesting.
I like the ones with the bark on them. The key is finding sticks where the bark doesn't just fall off. And I found this product. These are actually pencils.
Yes.
You can buy these off Amazon, and they're pencils made out of sticks. And I'm going to try making some ties out of these and see if that doesn't work out okay. They're about the right size. I can cut them down to 4 inches, and the diameter is almost exactly what we need. So I've got great hope that these may work out well, and I've ordered a bunch more of these on the outside chance that they actually work out.
I just hope you can get the lead out.
Or at least find some way to cover up the fact that there's a black dot on the end of the tie. But I like these dowel ties, and we went and found some new dowels, because this wood was really, really hard. But it sands, and other than the fact that I'm going to have to pre-drill the spike holes, I think those are going to work out just fine.
We'll keep our fingers crossed.
We'll keep our fingers crossed. But I like the way you're carving the bark in here and then painting it. And the newest ones that you've done out of the softer dowels, I think are actually going to work out really, really well.
Easier to score them.
Yes. The biggest problem here is the really hard nature of these dowels. Now, the inspiration for using logs as ties is, well, a lot of the logging railroads did that.
Wow.
Pretty primitive practices in a lot of places when you get right down to it. In fact, not only would they use logs for ties, sometimes they'd use logs for rails.
Oh my goodness, I was wondering why the wheels were so wide.
Yeah, so if they didn't have access to metal rails, they just lay the logs on the ground. Anyway, I guess logs make perfectly good rails.
I've heard of a freight train taking a dirt road, but what the heck is this?
This is a logging railroad going aquatic, I guess.
I guess so.
And amphibious. Well, again, whatever it took to get the job done, they just did.
Wow.
Because a lot of this stuff was just being very, very temporarily thrown together to get the trees out, and then the last thing they do is tear the rails and ties back up and probably recycle the ties and maybe even turn that into lumber. I don't know what they did.
Wow.
But or burn them in the locomotive for fuel.
As they pulled them up behind. Yeah, there we go.
So that's one of the things I really love about logging railroads is just the oddball nature of the equipment and the really pragmatic nature of just get her done.
I guess so.
Of course, it took a lot of manpower to do logging. It's very, very heavy work, and then when I see a picture like this, I don't even quite know what to say about a thing like this. I think it's actually the caption that I find the most disturbing.
Right.
Anyway, not all logging railroads were little backwater affairs. A lot of them were major, heavy, almost like Class A railroads, running very heavy equipment on very well-laid track and building some really impossible structures.
Oh my goodness.
Again, the lumber was free, so...
I don't think oh man, I wouldn't go across there.
That'd be terrifying.
Yes.
But it'd be really terrifying just building this structure. Yeah. Now, in keeping with the technique that a lot of people are using, we're building the add-on to Steve's logging railroad out of this expanded styrene product, XPS insulation. The pink and blue and that kind of stuff that you can get at Home Depot. So I started off by marking out the track plan on here, figuring out the curvatures. There's also going to be a single switch in the middle of this where there's a little single stall engine house, and then double checking clearances as I went by just laying track, temp track, and equipment into place to make sure that everything was going to clear and look okay as I figured out the track plan. I also wanted to haul out our logging locomotives. We're going to be doing a couple of Tuesday shows on these. We've actually got 5 different logging locomotives.
Yes, I love that little shay.
Yeah, we've got 2 different shays. This is, I think, my favorite. It's just a fun little shay, and we'd never fired it up before, and so we fired it up just to make sure it was going to work. Now, another feature on these logging railroads is they were typically built with really, really, really small rail, light rail, quite often just like a 30-pound rail. And we wanted to duplicate that as we were doing the log ties. Then I wanted to put the lightest possible rail on top of here. Now, Steve had built the original section of the railroad using Code 148 rail, and that scales out to about 30-pound rail, and it looks really neat.
I like it.
Now, the way you figure these things out in model railroads, the code number of the rail measures the height in thousandths of an inch. So 148, code 148, is 0.148 tall, where on real railroads they measure this by weight. 30-pound rail means that 3 feet of rail weighs 30 pounds. So while Steve has laid the original section of track in code 148, which properly scales out to 30-pound rail, unfortunately this can lead to some significant operational problems depending on what kind of equipment that you want to run on here. Our logging locomotives have a flange that measures 0.166.
Oh.
So if we run that on the 148 rail, it runs into every tie and spike, and it isn't going to work. It just simply isn't going to work. The other part of the railroad, the switching yard and so on, is laid in code 250, which scales out to be just under 6 inches high and would be fairly typical on a branch line railroad. So for the logging railroad, we're going to have to compromise, and I'm planning to use code 215. So I'm going to have to tear up what's already there and relay that, as well as all the new sections in code 215. Now, my original plan was to simply glue the ties down to the XPS foam insulation, but I realized that since we have to come back with a belt sander and level everything off, that would probably end up ripping all the ties loose from the foam insulation.
And sending them into orbit.
Anyway, I got the track plan all completely worked out here. It's a pretty simple track plan. This is one of my favorite features here. The little single stall engine house will actually have a Y-shaped switch. A number 4 frog, very sharp, with a Y-shaped switch going into that. Now, to hold these ties in place, we needed to find an appropriate plywood that could be laid on top of the foam insulation without adding any significant thickness to it. And we found this stuff here. It's a very, very thin craft plywood. You can see it's only 1.5 millimeters thick.
It's teeny.
It's teeny, so it'll cut and work very easily, but it'll have all the strength needed to hold the ties down so they don't fly off when we hit them with the belt sander. But this meant that I had to transfer the entire track plan over to the plywood and then cut that out with saber saw. So I glued the plywood in place with the same adhesive that we used for gluing the sheets of foam together. It's this Loctite foam adhesive, the blue stuff, and that way it wouldn't attack the foam, and I figured it would hold the plywood neatly in place. I needed to figure out some way to brace this while the glue dried, so I just wandered all over the shop looking for anything heavy that we could set on top of the plywood while the glue dries. Actually, the way it turned out is I didn't really need to add all of this weight. I found a much simpler way of going about this. It seems that once the plywood is down, it wants to curl toward the outside edges. So if I can just brace the outside edges, as it curls, it puts more and more pressure toward the middle. So I just used my finishing nails that I've been using for holding scenery in place, braced the edges, and that's all it actually took to get this to dry straight and true. And now we were ready to glue ties down to the plywood, and then I could hit them with the sander without them flying away. Now, as I mentioned, the number 4 Y switch feeds off to a little single stall engine shop, and in this case the rails are going to be laid directly on top of 1/4 inch plywood, and so the 1/4 inch plywood needs to be level with the ties, and the ties are sitting on top of the very, very thin plywood, and that leaves quite a bit of an edge right here. But I figured this will all be solved with the belt sander once I take the belt sander to all of the ties and level the tops off. Now, this is a fun feature on the part of the railroad that Steve built, this little short bridge built entirely out of logs, and I want to duplicate that on the new part of the railroad as well. And building bridges out of logs, as we said, is prototype practice. Why dress up the logs more than is needed? Simply build your bridges out of logs and, where need be, level off the tops or whatever.
Oh my gosh, where's Paul Bunyan?
Look at the size of those logs. I don't know if that's redwood or whatever, but that is one huge bridge. And if you can't put it together any other way, I guess you can just use cribbing and build a bridge that way.
Well, there you go. Go.
You know, these logging railroads are just very pragmatic. Anyway, here's our little gap that we need to bridge, and the neat thing about it is I placed it right in the very middle of the Y-shaped number 4 switch so that the points actually cross right over the little small bridge. I thought that would be a really fun feature.
That's cool.
So I've been looking forward to building this little bridge, and now that the roadbed's down and everything's figured out, I think that's the next step, is build the little bridge that's going to go in here using Steve's bridge as a, sort of a prototype practice, if you will. And then that way also everything matches from one end of the railroad to the other. So right here at the point end of the Y switch is where the log bridge is going to be dropped down in there. So I built this at the bench, and I built it upside down. And then that way the tops of the ties are all going to be perfectly level. It doesn't matter if the bottom of the bridge is level, that will just set down into the foam. So I cut these, I guess you'd call these the stringers. They're just the notched logs that are flat on top. And then that way I can glue the ties to the flat section, and the notches will tie into some logs that I'm using as abutments on either end of the bridge. And there it is. Just that simple.
Right.
It's
cool.
It's stinking cute.
It is.
And so now to fit it into place, I'm going to need 2 logs to lay at either end to function sort of as abutments. And I've just cut those to length, and now I need to sort of fashion the foam around those so that the whole bridge sits in nice and flat and level, and the tops of the ties line up with the ties that we're going to be putting in there. But there it is.
That's really cool.
That's really neat. Now, I didn't use logs for the ties because this is in the middle of the switch, and that would just create more grief than I know what to do with. Now, when I first set it in place, you can see it sits quite high, which is good because it's a lot easier to take foam away than it is to add foam back in. So with just a small amount of carving into the foam, I was able to drop the bridge down in and get the tops of the ties to line up neatly with the tops of the existing ties.
That's cool.
And I'm ready to lay a switch on top of this whole thing. That'll be really fun. Now, as I don't have any of the Code 215 track, it's on order, I just temporarily laid some Code 250 on top of here to make sure that the tops of the ties all line up and the rail's going to sit on here nice and level and true once I come back with the Code 215 and build the switch. And now that the abutments and everything are carved into the foam, I can come back and carve out the shape of the entire canyon, periodically dropping my little bridge into place to make sure that I'm not taking stuff away where I don't want to. That everything stays nice and level, and I can come back and start carving away everything that doesn't look like the gully that this thing bridges across. Well, there's the progress so far.
Wow.
It's coming together.
Literally, yes.
Literally. I'm really looking forward to getting this 215 rail so we can lay that, and then we can try running the shay on the proper railroad, and that'll be really fun.
It will be.
Well, once we get the logging railroad whipped into shape, we'll be getting back onto the coaling tower.
In the meantime, we'll be logging off.
Indeed. In other words, here comes the blue button. Zoink! Right there. The blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday as we mess around with one final goose.
There we go.